Welcome back. You're watching the CNBC-TV18 special. We're in conversation with Nobel laureate Abhijit Banerjee. I want to talk a little bit about global growth and you know, there's two camps out there. One that believes that technology has probably now gotten commoditized and not going to be able to see the kind of transformative changes that we saw, and global growth is going to be between this 1 to 2% kind of range. There's the other camp that believes that that's not going to be quite the case, at least for the West. How do you see global growth from here on, and the challenges that then it throws up for things like income inequality and poverty alleviation?
To be honest, I think one of the points we make in the book, and I've tried to make all my life in a sense, is that there are many questions which don't necessarily have answers.
One of them?
One of the questions doesn't have answers. God knows what's going to happen. We really have very few episodes. We think of growth as going on forever, but it started about 1850. Till then, growth was always slow, very, very slow. It's picked up after 1850 in the US, and after 1920 or depending on the country, maybe in Western Europe, it really picks up after 1945. And then it grows very fast for a while, then it stops. Do we really know that much? I mean, these are 30 years of fast growth. That's all we know. Of all of human history, there were 30 years of fast growth in Western Europe. We can make up infinite number of stories. I don't know that we know that much. It's just 30 years or 30 years. I mean, it could happen that this was one-off. It could be that it'll come back. We don't actually understand the mechanics of it well enough. We kind of think that countries at some point use up the fact that there was a bunch of slack in the economy, there were resources that were not being used very well. They get used up after a point, and so growth slows because there's no free resources anymore. But when that happens, and how technology interacts with that, and is the technologies change? I mean, basically, despite all the great innovations in information technology we've seen in the last 25 years, productivity growth is still way below it was between 1945 and 1975. I mean, in the U.S., for example, the U.S. being the home of Apple, Microsoft, Google, etc., productivity growth is pretty much what it was before 1945, and hasn't come back to the 1945 to 75 peak. So, that's a fact that is interesting, troubling. Does that mean it's impossible? No. Does it mean it's inevitable? No.
Well, we just don't know yet. We just don't know
yet. And we may not.
And we may not. But, what does this mean then in the context of the choices that we will see governments make to deal with poverty, especially when there's a more insular approach being taken? There are forces against trade and globalization. How do you see that impacting the way that income inequality as well as poverty alleviation is going to be addressed in the future?
So I think that that's a very, very interesting and complicated question. I'll maybe hit little pieces of it. I mean, who knows what's going to happen? I mean, one of the things we see world over is a move towards the extreme right in politics, and that has consequences for whether economics will even be central to the conversation. Maybe we're just going to be fighting ethnic battles throughout the world for the next 25 years. I mean, I actually, in the world, economy looks much more fragile than I thought even 10 years ago. I thought it was pretty robust, and it turns out that because partly we had ignored the already large explosion of inequality, we might be in a place which is very uncomfortable. So, now within that, I would say that I think people are using trade to cover up a fundamental unequal basis of the internal economy. That it's not that trade. I think trade has done some damage. I think technology has done some damage. But I think the nature of of good, effective welfare states is to undo that damage. And a lot of countries, especially countries in the Anglo-Saxon countries, have been very bad at using that instruments. They have not done anything for the people who got hurt by trade. And as a result, they really lost everything. Wages of the bottom 20% in the US has basically stayed flat for 30 years. So that's a fact that we should not blame on trade per se. I think trade, if you take trade and say, trade is not going to cause any problems, so we don't need to do anything about it, then you're making a policy mistake. But I don't think that means that you should ban trade. It means you should create a policy frame within which the effects of trade are mediated.
So your prescription, in order for the world to sort of get through this period of addressing some of the inequalities on account of technology and trade, is higher taxes and then better distribution, so that you actually don't leave so many people behind.
That's right.
But is that the thinking that you're seeing? Is that the risk that you're seeing, that we're still not being able to see this percolate into policy making?
I think if you hear the Democratic candidates in the US now, I think they're beginning to talk about it. I think some of them are talking about much higher tax rates. And I think they are talking about broader-based redistribution. But I want to also make a specific point, which is that I think part of the mistake we make is to decide that the way you deal with trade is by general welfare policy. I think one of the things you have to deal with is that people get hit by trade, they're really clobbered, those people. So you have to do something for them. So it has the policy, it can't be just very general. It needs to be specific and targeted as well.
So in the Indian context then, and we're still under 2% of global trade, and the aspiration is to double exports and so on and so forth. What is it that you would think needs to be the prescriptions that the government must keep in mind from a policy point of view as we move down this road?
I think a much better understanding of who are the people who are going to be get hurt by it. I do think that, the evidence from India is also that while trade liberalization in general was good for the economy, the places where poverty fell the least were places which were most exposed to trade. So I just think we can't afford to ignore the clear signals we have, which is that certain people really get clobbered by opening to trade, and those people need special policies, or you need to think of what to do for the areas where they live, or do something which is sort of bails them out. Because after all, they didn't make you change trade policy. They're just the kind of passive victims of it.
Well, speaking of one of the challenges that we specifically face here in India is financial inclusion, access to credit, insurance and so on and so forth. We've seen some schemes being unveiled by the government, being rolled out, especially Ayushman Bharat on the insurance side. Do you believe that this is a step in the right direction and much more of this kind of policy initiative is required?
So I think that Ayushman Bharat is absolutely something that addresses a real need. I think the real need is that if your mother gets cancer, for most people, that can wipe out your entire, everything you own. And that's just not a good way either from an economic point of view, because your livelihood is destroyed, or from a welfare point of view. So I think it's a good idea. It needs to be implemented well, and it's not a trivial thing to do, because of course the possibility of fraud is rife. But I think it's something that they should use all the expertise available to make it work. I think that the presumption of Jan Dhan is a bit more that its savings is going to substitute for credit. I don't see a strong evidentiary basis for that claim. I think people just don't save a lot, and whereas when they need credit, it's usually for an emergency, a daughter's wedding or something, and then they pay absurd interest rates. So I don't think that's going to be solved by people saving 5 rupees, 10 rupees, 100 rupees. It's going to be...
The access to credit will have to be designed
for it.
You brought up the issue about the fall in demand that we're seeing, and whether a corporate tax cut would necessarily be the way out of that. But what do you believe should be done at this point in time to stimulate demand, given the fiscal deficit concerns that you have?
But the fiscal deficit concerns, I mean, after all, I think the corporate tax cut, the amount of money that it will cost the fisc is roughly twice what NYAY pays. So there's a lot of money there which could have been used differently. If I had to think about it, I mean, now that it's done, I don't know what to say, but I would have gone the other way. I would have taken that money and pumped it into the hands of the poor. Instead of cutting corporate taxes, I would have pumped the money into the hands of the poor. I think that would have been a more effective way to revive the economy. I think if you raised NYAY wages temporarily, for example, you could, or doubled the PM Kisan, or quadrupled it, you would get a lot of money in the hands of people, and they would be spending that money, and that might have revived the rural economy quite fast.
It comes back to the consumption versus investment argument, the government saying that we want to bet on reviving investment at this point in time.
Correct, but I'm not convinced that there is any evidence that investment in a demand slump, you revive investment by cutting taxes.